Morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you. We were just talking, it's been probably, we said 3 years. I have a feeling it might even be longer than that. So I know it was pre-COVID, and I was still at Arkadelphia when Mike asked me to come and be with you. But when you get to be my age, 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years. You know what I'm talking about? So that used to be impressive when the Bible mentioned that about God, but now it's like, I know how He feels. So, well, it's New Year's Day, isn't it? And I know that's a kind of a human-generated marker on our calendar, but it is a day that we celebrate new beginnings. And it seems like this day and age, it gets easier and easier to say goodbye to the year that just passed by with all of its troubles and controversies and events that go on. And we look with hope towards the coming year. And many people make personal commitments to reform themselves. I will eat better, I will exercise more, I will watch my money more, I won't binge watch on Netflix as much, I will go to church more, I will, whatever it is that we do. You know, we make our New Year's resolutions. And I would like to suggest a resolution that we should all think about today. And that is a resolution to remember the most important mission field that God has given to each and every one of us. We like to talk about going on mission trips. We give to Lottie Moon and Annie Armstrong on our mission offerings and our state offering, of course. We give to the cooperative program. We volunteer at soup kitchens. We do all these mission type things. We have revivals. Some of us, at least in the older days, went to evangelism classes and learned how to share our faith and learn the scriptures. And all of those things are fantastic, and we should do those. But the most important mission field that God has given you are your relationships. The people that are in your life are the most important people for you. You have a relationship with God, obviously, and you have one with yourself. That's one I can't really get together very well, is the one I have with myself. I can't stand me sometimes. But we have our family at home, we have our co-workers, we have our friends, we have our fellow church members. And I don't know who said that because my back was turned, but I walked in on the end of the ladies' Sunday school class here, and one of them said, I'm just thankful that we have Christian friends. And that meant a lot to me because that's what it's all about. We need each other, don't we? We need each other to get through this uncertain life. So our relationships are very important. And what I am learning is that a relationship based on just getting along is not a complete relationship that God has in mind. It is a relationship that needs to be effective. Whatever condition your relationship might be in, you may have 50 relationships and 49 of them are great, but there's one that's just not so great, you know. And depending on who it is and how much they're in your life, it can really poke at you, can't they? And it can cause you stress and pressure. We all have relationships we struggle with. And I want to look in Genesis chapter 32. And I want to talk about a strategy for how we can repair damaged or vulnerable relationships in our lives. And it is centered on the story of Jacob. Now, probably most of you here are familiar with Jacob and his twin brother Esau. Has everybody heard of them? Right? They were the twin grandchildren of Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. His son Isaac and Rebekah gave birth to these two twin boys. And it was important that they had children because God had told Abraham, many nations are going to come from you. Well, Rebekah ends up with twins in her womb. And she notices that they are really active and struggling against each other. My little daughter-in-law, she is expecting my first grandchild. Not her first child, that doesn't matter. It's my first grandchild, and I will be in charge of it. But her and my son talk all the time about how that little baby in there is just kicking and punching and just very active. And I remember my own wife, when we had our youngest son, and he was in the womb, he was that way as well. And I don't imagine that my wife or my daughter-in-law would like to think about two very active children in their womb, not only active and keeping her awake all the time, but the Bible says struggling together. So even in the womb, they couldn't get along very well. And Rebekah asked the Lord about this, and the Lord said, you've got two nations in your womb, and they are struggling against each other. And the younger one will come out, the older one will serve the younger, is how he said it. Now you think, how can one be older or younger? Because they're twins. They're both in there, and they're both going to be born the same day, probably the same hour. Well, how did they calculate that? The one that comes out first is the firstborn, right? And being the firstborn was very important. So the one that they eventually named Esau, a rugged, hunting he-man, a man's man, came out first. And as he was coming out of the womb, they noticed a little hand on the heel of that baby. And that was the hand of the second one, who they called Jacob, which means, in the Hebrew, heel catcher. And the idea was that he would be somebody that would supplant somebody else. In other words, he would work and take over a position that somebody else had. And in the case of him and his brother, that was Esau, as being the firstborn. And the firstborn in those days, they got the blessing of the father. The firstborn would be the primary one to carry on the nation and the traditions of the tribe. And they would get a double portion of inheritance so that they could fulfill their duty as the priest and kind of unofficial king and exalted father of the growing tribe. And that was very important, and God blessed that. And Esau got that birthright. And when the boys were older, the mother Rebekah and the technically youngest son Jacob got talking, and they remembered God's prophecy that the older of the brother or the nation would serve the younger, and so they felt that that meant that the birthright belonged to Jacob. And so they schemed, and because the father Isaac was old and dim with his eyesight, they dressed Jacob up in the clothing of his older brother, and he put hair of, I think, a goat on his arms and his neck so that the father would think that Jacob was the hairy one, and that's what Esau meant, was the red, ruddy, and hairy guy, and Isaac would embrace his son, thinking he was embracing Esau, and pray and impart on him the blessing. But Jacob went in instead while Esau was gone, out hunting. And even though Isaac was a little suspicious, he felt the hair on his smooth son's arms and neck, and he smelled the scent of Esau on his garment, and he accepted the fact that that was, in his belief, Esau. And he poured out all the blessings on Jacob. Esau found out. Was he happy? No, not at all. He was out for blood. He was going to kill Jacob. Isn't it sad when siblings become enemies with each other? And we see it today, don't we? And some of you may have been affected by that. And it's an awful thing. And just the smallest little issues can break us apart. Nevertheless, stealing a birthright from somebody. So Jacob had to get out of town. Rebekah sent him up north of the Syrian territory called Padan Aram, where her brother Laban lived. And she said, you better go live with him for a while until Esau cools down. Jacob goes up there and he lives with Laban, falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, and as a dowry he says, I will work 7 years for this woman, Rebekah. Laban said, fine, that's good, do that. And so he worked for 7 years. The Bible tells us it just skipped by because he was so excited about the prospect of marrying this daughter. On the marriage night, Laban appealing to the customs of his people, thought it was improper that the younger daughter be married first. And so he slipped his older daughter Leah into the marriage tent, and Jacob had her as his wife. And when he finds out, they argue and he's upset, and Laban explains why. Jacob met his match, basically, as far as being a trickster. And so he says, I'm going to work another 7 years for Rachel. And he does. He has, by the time we get to our story, 11 children, or 12 children. He's got 11 sons and 1 daughter, born by his 2 wives, sisters Rachel and Leah, and by their maidservants. And all of these 11 boys, Benjamin would be born later, and that would cost Rebekah her life, or Rachel her life. But all these boys and this daughter was the prosperity of Jacob. Jacob was very crafty and very skilled in working in his uncle's herds and flocks. And God blessed Laban because of Jacob's labors. Now here's where we start to get to our story. We get to the end of 14 years and Jacob says, it's time for me to go back to my people. And he wants to get all his family and his possessions together, and Laban hears about it, and Laban says, I don't want you to go because God's blessing me through you. And Jacob says, I will continue to work for your herds for a while more. But, and Laban says, just tell me what your wages are. And Jacob, in his own craftiness, he says, give me all of your goats that are spotted, multicolored, ring-straked, however the Bible describes it, and all the lambs that are black. Laban thought he had a good idea, and he says, that's great, because there weren't very many of those. They were rare in his herds. He says, go ahead, you can have those. But before Jacob could claim them, Laban went through the herds and took them out himself and moved them way off 3 days away. And so Jacob started with nothing but solid-colored animals. What's he going to do? Well, he knows about selective breeding, and he knows about natural medicine, and so he sets up a plan to where he enables the stronger animals that he knows from experience will give birth to these multicolored goats and black sheep, and he gives them the advantage of breeding until eventually, after a few years go by, he has a great herd of his own. And he says, I've got to get out of here. Laban keeps changing the deal. Laban is not fair to work with. And so he takes his family and his possessions and he gets out of there in secret. Laban finds out, catches up. They have a powwow about it, and finally Laban says, okay, there's not much I can do. You go. You go your way. Now we get to this point in Jacob's life where before Jacob was contending with his crafty uncle, a fellow con man really, they were both gifted at that, fighting with each other over material possessions. There wasn't really anything life-threatening about that. But now he's got to go home. Now he has to go home to his brother, who's bigger than he is, who's angry because of what he did 20 years before, and he doesn't know if Esau is still holding that grudge. And so I can imagine a big knot just formed in his stomach as he got ready to face his brother. It was a long ways off, but that trip would have been made more grueling with this uncertainty that he was going to have to face his brother. And so here's what happens in chapter 32. It says in verse 1, and Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, he called the name of that place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother into the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And that was the area, the territory, where Moses and the Israelites had come through into the Sinai Peninsula and up into the southern regions of Canaan. And that was where Esau made his home and begat his people as he intermarried with other tribes in that area. It wasn't very far from where his father Isaac was living. But before he sent this message, Jacob encountered some angels. He's on his way back, and a camp of angels meet him. Now, what is significant about this? The Bible doesn't say much about it, but it is significant because when Jacob 20 years earlier was coming out of his homeland and going up to Syria, to Padan Aram, to his uncle's house, he stopped at a place and he used a stone for a pillow. Do you remember that story? And he had a vision that night. A vision of a great ladder that extended from the surface of the earth up into the heavens. And the angels were going up and down on that ladder. And then God spoke to Jacob and says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to prosper you. A great nation is going to come from you. God solidified His covenant with Jacob that He had made with Abraham, his grandfather. Now 20 years later, Jacob is going back, but instead of the angels going up and down on a ladder, which was a symbol of the fact that God's angels and God Himself is involved with the affairs of humankind. And that's what God does. That's what He has His angels do. The Bible talks about the roles of the angels, and Jacob saw that. But now as he's going back towards his brother, the angels aren't on a ladder in a vision, but they're there, very real, and they meet him. And what Jacob received from that was that now he had personal protection from the Lord. That God said, not only am I involved in the affairs of the human race, but I am involved in your affairs. My friends, that is the first thing I want you to always keep in mind. And I know you know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But God is involved in your personal affairs. Your family, your circle of friends, your social organizations, your extended family, your relatives, your in-laws, your workplace, your church. God is involved with you. And this was setting Jacob up for a very important reminder, which we'll get to in just a few moments. But Jacob must have been comforted by this. I know I would. If I were to go back to some guy that was a lot bigger and tougher than me and he was out to kill me 20 years before, I'd be nervous and I would welcome all the angels God wanted to send. Just bring them on, God. I like having you guys around, right? So you know he liked that. Because Jacob had grown into a tribe of his own. And so he knew that Esau would have as well. Now here comes the strategy. Now this comes from the skill of a master strategist. Somebody who could use cunning and wit and strategy to get his own way. Jacob is one that could follow you into a revolving door and come out first. You know what I'm talking about? You know anybody like that? He was one of those people. And he very wisely crafts a strategy to deal with his brother. Verse 3 again, Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother unto the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, Thus shall you speak unto my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob said this, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed there until now. And I have oxen and donkeys, flocks and men servants and women servants, and I have sent to tell my Lord that I may find grace in your sight. There's two steps to Jacob's strategy in these verses. The first step was to send the messenger. He didn't want to just show up one day in that land that was next to Edom, and messengers from Edom tells Esau that Jacob just arrived from somewhere and risk Esau still being mad and raising up an army and just marching a few days over to Isaac's territory and destroying Jacob and maybe his family and possessions. He didn't want that. Folks, we have to be careful. If we have a relationship that needs strengthening, if we have a relationship that is struggling, this is the approach we need to take. We need to prepare the ground in that other person's life. Well, how do I do that if I see them every week or maybe every day? What if I have a coworker that can't stand me, I can't stand them? or I have an in-law or a relative, a cousin, or even somebody used to be my friend, and we see each other regularly, how do I prepare the ground? You do it in a way that as you approach them, you do it differently. You do it humbly. What is our go-to disposition, our attitude when it comes to conflict? We make our case, don't we? We want the other person to know that we understand we're right. We want them to see it our way so that they can settle down and grow up and be a respectable adult in our lives, right? We want them to practice what we don't practice ourselves, and that's empathy. We need to begin the skill of empathy, and it starts with humility. And like Jacob, he sent a messenger to his brother, and he did that so that his brother would know that Jacob is coming. And then Esau could think about it and maybe deal with it a little bit differently than if Jacob just sprung a surprise on him and said, "Here I am, let's get along." He prepared the ground. Find a way, pray and ask the Lord to help you find a way to prepare the ground in relationships you need to strengthen. And by the way, these don't need to be relationships that are going sour or that are even weak. It might be relationships that are strong. How do you make them stronger? How do you be more godly and influential in that person's life? It's the same strategy. Prepare the ground. And do it with humility. Do it with love. Do it with a disposition that you want the best for them, and you're willing to listen to them rather than demand that they listen to you all the time. I want to stand here and say to you that's probably one of the hardest things you can do, especially when the other person doesn't get the hint and doesn't change. They keep doing the stuff that aggravates you. They keep talking to you in a way that offends your pride. They keep doing things that offend you, saying things that get on your nerves. And Lord knows you're trying, you're doing your best, you're reforming yourself, and the other person doesn't change. And it's hard to keep going. You want to revert back to your flesh and just let them have it, don't you? I know. Trust me, I know. We have to be humble. We have to start from a loving position. And don't let your pride be the indicator of your performance or the validity of your beliefs. He sent a messenger to Esau, and the message was this. He said, "Esau, I am coming. I've been living with Laban." So he's using accountability. He's saying, this is where I was. I've lived with Laban, and God has given me a lot of stuff. He says, I have oxen and donkeys, flocks, men servants, women servants, and I have sent to tell my Lord that I may find grace in your sight. Why would Jacob say this to Esau? Why is this step number 2 in the strategy? It sounds like Jacob is saying, hey Esau, I didn't need you and I don't fear you. I've got a lot of stuff. So there. And I'm coming with my stuff and you better just accept it. Is that what he was doing? No, he used language like my Lord, which is a old English way of showing respect for somebody in a higher position than you. He referred to himself as his servant, Esau's servant, your servant. You see the humility there? But why does he tell his brother about all his possessions? Because he was removing any sense of threat that Esau might feel. And what's the threat? Was Esau intimidated by Jacob? No. Esau could have taken Jacob's head and pinched it off without a problem. He wasn't afraid physically of Jacob. He was afraid of Jacob, who now was the heir of his father's estate, and who might take that understanding of God's blessings and extend it to Esau's own positions and come with some army and try to take what belonged to Esau. What Jacob was doing was saying, Esau, don't be worried about me or what I am or have or want to do. God has given me so much that I'm not after anything in your life. I just want to find grace. That's all I want. I want to be reconciled. Yeah, Jacob took that birthright, and had it not been for the threat of death, he might have stayed around and he could have taken advantage of it and extended his own reputation and position and possessions at the expense of Esau's. But really, when you think about it, after 20 hard years of labor with an equally trickster uncle, learning about life, Jacob had been blessed by God by his own merit. God blessed Jacob not because of what Jacob got from Isaac, but from what Jacob got from the Lord Himself. He removed the threat. We need to find a way to remove the threat we might pose in the life of somebody else. You look at me and you know that I wouldn't be a threat to most men because I'm not that big, but I might have a threat that somebody might see me as threatening to something in their life. They may see you as threatening to somebody in your life. They want something from me. Why is Brent being so nice to me? He must be after something. Have you ever seen people do that? When they want something, all of a sudden you're their favorite person. Right? Oh, you did such a good job on that. Man, I really admire your skill. I really love working for you. I want to do better and blah, blah, blah. And they lay on the flattery and they act like your humble servant, but they want something. And people can see you coming a mile away if you have an agenda. Because we are skilled at putting up our defenses, aren't we? I mean, shoot, we can't even trust God. How can we trust other people naturally? That's a big struggle. So you have to remove the threat that you might pose in their life. And Jacob did that. He said, I've got all this stuff. I don't need your stuff. I'm not even after Father's stuff. God has blessed me. You are the Lord. I am your servant. I just want grace in your sight. Man, how diplomatic, how humble, how wise for him to do this. We get to verse 6, and the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and also he comes to meet you, and 400 men with him. Oh boy, that's not good news, is it? Why does Esau need to bring 400 men? Jacob could only fear the worst. And that's that he was bringing an army to annihilate him right there in the wilderness. He's going to finish what he wanted to do 20 years ago. Now, Jacob also knew of God's promises and he had God's protection, but it's still hard to face such a threat like what Esau posed to him and not be intimidated. And so he implements the third part of his strategy. Verse 7, then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that was with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 bands. And he said, if Esau comes to the one company and smites it, then the other company which is left shall escape. He was practicing insurance. Margin is a word, I call it in our ministry that I'm starting, that deals with this stuff. Margin, a cushion of protection between you and disaster. Jacob said, if Esau's coming, maybe I can only let him have half of us, and the other half can escape. If he kills me, maybe his vengeance will be satisfied and won't even care about the other ones. I'll just move them somewhere else, and they can travel south in a different location. And so he divided up into 2 companies. Half his possessions and families and servants went one way, and he stayed with another one with his wives, and they went another way. So he divided the forces so that he could lessen the chance of total catastrophe. Our strategy needs to involve ways in which we can protect ourselves against the worst that can happen with that relationship. And we need to tread lightly with this, and we need to be careful, and we need to be wise. We need to know when to move forward with somebody and when to back off. We need to do whatever we can to make sure that the very worst outcome possible will not happen. That could be divorce. That could be leaving your church in anger. That could mean bankruptcy or being fired. It could mean all sorts of terrible things that happen in our relationships. Do what it takes to make sure that the very worst outcome possible doesn't happen. And God will give you the wisdom and the smarts to do something like that. You follow me? And that's what Jacob did. We are so caught up in taking it to the Lord in prayer, which we should. In fact, that's going to be the next step of the strategy. But we get so caught up in the spiritual part that we forget God gives us common sense. You know, Jacob didn't come up with his craftiness and his strategy on his own. I mean, he was naturally gifted by God for some of that. He didn't always use it right, but he was gifted that way. And He will give you the intelligence to know how far, how soon, when to back off, when to go forward with your relationship. That's strategy number 3. And then strategy number 4. And because it's in 4th place doesn't mean it's 4th in importance. It's the most important. You take it to God and you rest on His promises. Jacob said to God in verse 9, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord which said unto me, Return into your country and to your kindred, and I will deal well with you. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown unto your servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands. Deliver me, I pray you, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me, and the mother with the children. And you said, I will surely do you good, and make your seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So step number 4 is that he took it to the Lord based on God's promises. Again, God said, I'm going to protect you. I've sent angels to meet you. That should tell you I'm protecting you. But Esau's still a very scary person in his mind. He remembers how mad Esau was before he left. And now he's got 400 men, probably as ornery as he is. That's intimidating. What if God forgets His promises? What if I did something wrong and God withdrew His protection, and so he goes to the Lord? Folks, if you have a relationship that is struggling, if you have something in yourself that is struggling and you need to make that New Year's commitment, the first place you need to go to is the Lord. And rest on the promises that He will bless you if you bless Him with your service. I know I need to move on because we're getting out of time. But that's the most important one. Verse 13, And he lodged there that same night, and he took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother, 200 she-goats and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels and their colts, 40 kine and 10 bulls, 20 she-donkeys and 10 foals. That's a lot of livestock. He culls that out of his own herd and he says, I'm going to give that to my brother as a present. Maybe I can appease him with this generosity. And in verse 16, And he delivered them into the hands of his servants, every drove by themselves. And he said unto his servants, Pass over before me, and put a space between drove and drove. So what he did is he divided these droves into groups, and he sent them in increments. And he told his servants to tell Esau, This is a present from your servant Jacob, and he wants to reconcile with you. And as Esau receives that present, and he's thinking about his own emotions, a little bit later on, another group of animals comes over the horizon. And the servants of that group says, This is some more of the present for you from your servant Jacob. And then after that, another group would come, and so forth, until the whole present was presented to Esau. You see what he's doing? He's using a strategic way of appeasing his damaged relationship. He wasn't buying the mercy of Esau so much as he was appealing to the dignity of his brother. He was appealing to the dignity, and he was saying, whatever I stole from you with that birthright, I want to give some of it back. Because as I told you with my messenger beforehand, God has blessed me and given me all that I need. And however I've wronged you, I want to give some of it back. And the Bible says, it says at the end of verse 20, peradventure he will accept of me this gift, is what he's saying. So the fifth and final phase of the strategy is that we make whatever restitution we need. You might be thinking, I don't owe that scoundrel of one red nickel from what they did to me. Well, if that's how you want to think, that's fine, but you're not going to get reconciliation. I don't need to apologize. I don't need to make overtures because they're the ones that were in the wrong. Okay, fine. Fine. If you don't want them in your life as a healthy relationship, just take that posture. You can do that. Sure. But what will you say to the Lord one day when He looks at you and says, how did you handle the people that I gave you? Oh, wife, kids, they're all great. What about that church member that disagreed with you in some business meeting about the color of wallpaper in the back bathroom or whatever? You know how Baptists fight over stuff. You've been enemies for the rest of your life in that church. What about that? What are you going to say to God? What would we say? We couldn't get along with our mother-in-law or our cousin or a co-worker. Well, they were wrong. I was right. So that's why, God. You think He's going to accept that? You think He's going to be impressed? Who was the one that loved people even though He was wronged? Jesus, right? If we're going to be Christ-like, we don't be a doormat. Not saying that. We don't lay down and let people stomp on us. But there's times where we have to make those gifts. Not maybe monetary or possession, but we need to do something in the life of somebody and start paving the way to soothe them. And even though they may be in the wrong, and in your mind they are, you might learn how you contributed to it. And you might gain a seat at the table of their heart where they can share what the whole thing from their perspective. Be generous with yourself to other people, even if in your mind they should be the ones reaching out to you. That's a big lesson for me, is to give of yourself even though it may not have been deserved, because Jesus did that for me. And I know He can do that for you. Well, Jacob implemented a strategy, and he was reconciled with his brother. But something really briefly happened to him before that took place. God had to break Jacob. I don't know how it is, but he was there in the land of Gilead, and he sent everyone else ahead across this little stream called Jabbok. And he was there alone, and an angel of the Lord came up to him. And a lot of people believe that was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Himself, and I have no problem with that at all. I believe it was or could have been. But the messenger or angel of God came to Jacob, and then the Bible just jumps ahead and says they wrestled all night. What would an angel have to say? What kind of conversation would have to take place to where you pick a fight with a human being? I mean, that fascinates me. Did the angel just come up and say, hey, Jacob, you good at wrestling? Let's go after it, buddy. I don't know. I don't know what he did, but they contended with each other. They wrestled. I don't think it was a fist fight or anything, but they wrestled with each other. And daybreak happened, and the angel says, let me go. It's over. Day is happening. Just let me out of here. And Jacob says, no, not until you bless me. And the angel said, what is your name? Jacob probably sheepishly said, my name is Heel Catcher, Jacob. And the angel says, From now on, your name is going to be Israel, Prince of God. And you would think that that would be a mighty promotion, and it was. But in order to keep his servant humble, he just touched him right here on the side of the thigh or the hip. And it just went out of joint or stretched ligaments or whatever injury it was. And from then on, Jacob had to hobble when he walked. Because now he's not relying on Jacob. He's not relying on the power of his human flesh, but only on the power of God. So the mighty man of big herds and a big family marching through the wilderness to meet his angry brother is now a man that had to walk with the help of a staff. Half lame the way he walked, in pain as he walked. And Esau saw a man that was no longer lifted up in pride. If I could just leave you with one quick closing piece of counsel as you pursue your relationships. Do whatever you can to make sure that God is breaking your pride from your life. Because that's really what it takes. You want to be a true missionary in your family, in your church, in your neighborhood? Be broken of your pride.